What's up, y'all? I'm Dr. Brandon D. Elmore, and I want to welcome you to Critical Race Theory, a virtual learning series. And I'm so glad to have you back. Last week, we talked about how racism isn't just about individual bias, it's embedded into our systems, and how whiteness functions as property, granting access and privilege. Today, we're going to build on that by breaking down two more key tenets of CRT: interest-convergence and the critique of liberalism. These ideas help us to understand why racial progress is often temporary and why equality in the United States has always been conditional. Let us start with interest-convergence and how it played out in one of the most well-known Supreme Court rulings, Brown versus Board of Education. Derek Bell, one of the founding scholars of critical race theory who we've learned about in prior sessions, introduced interest-convergence in 1980. He argued that racial progress only happens when it aligns with the interests of those in power, not because of some moral shift or sudden commitment to justice. He was inspired by the 1954 Brown versus Ford case, which overturned the separate but equal doctrine established in 1896 by Plessy versus Ferguson. Brown v. Ford of 1954 ended school segregation, but not solely because of civil rights activism. The U.S. was in a Cold War and needed to present itself as a democratic leader, so segregation was essentially hurting its global image. And as it turns out, desegregation served white economic and political interests more than black students. Now let us fast forward to 2023, where the Supreme Court overturned affirmative action, proving once again that when racial progress no longer serves dominant interests, it's dismantled. Since its mandate, affirmative action provided a limited pathway to higher education for marginalized communities. But as soon as it no longer served those in power, it was removed. For example, in 2024, Black law student enrollment at Harvard Law School declined significantly after the overturn and ruling of affirmative action. The same institutions that once supported diversity now claim colorblindness as a reason to eliminate these programs. This highlights that affirmative action was tolerated when diversity benefited white institutions, but when racial diversity was no longer a priority, it was dismantled under the guise of fairness. This follows Bell's theory that progress is temporary and contingent on white interests. Now let's connect another key CRT concept, the critique of liberalism, which explains why racial justice efforts are often performative and short-lived. Within the lens of the critique of liberalism, we see that liberalism presents itself as neutral, colorblind, and progressive, but in reality it often maintains racial hierarchies. And CRT scholars argue that liberalism protects the status quo by emphasizing ideas of colorblindness, which ignores racial realities and ultimately reinforces inequality. They further claim it is rooted in white privilege, noting how it allows individuals to dismiss the significance of race and systemic disparities. This stance often serves as a way to counter movements like Black Lives Matter by shifting the focus to All Lives Matter, which overlooks the specific injustices faced by Black communities. And while colorblindness claims that ignoring race will solve inequality, it actually reinforces disparities by refusing to acknowledge them, and can be argued as a tactic under incrementalism, which is the slow, one-step-at-a-time approach to change that delays real progress. An example is HBCU funding disparities, where in 2020, the combined endowment of all 102 HBCUs was $19.5 billion, which is less than a third of Harvard's endowment alone. In 2024, Harvard's endowment reached $53.2 billion, while HBCUs continue to be underfunded. This shows how systemic inequities are left untouched under the gradual change approach, and also reinforces the idea that colorblind attempts present gradual change and can ignore the real realities that we live in. The final key concept within the critique of liberalism is the neutrality of law. The idea that laws are applied fairly to everyone. However, racial disparities in the legal system reveal how this supposed neutrality often upholds systemic inequality. For example, the U.S. prison system. When in 2024, Donald Trump, who was later convicted of 34 felonies, compared his prosecution to the treatment of Black individuals in the justice system. Yet, he evaded jail time and still won the presidency. Meanwhile, Black and brown individuals make up nearly 70% of the U.S. prison population, many incarcerated for far lesser offenses. This is what the neutrality of law looks like under the lens of the critique of liberalism. It claims fairness, but racial disparities expose its reality. Now, let's connect this to the post-George Floyd era and the rollback of racial justice efforts. In 2020, after the horrific murder of George Floyd, companies, schools, and institutions across the United States made bold commitments to anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and police reform. But in 2025, much of that has been rolled back, exposing the limits to liberalism and igniting the normalization of corporate DEI programs being dismantled as a response to political backlash. We're also seeing policing reforms being abandoned despite continued racial disparities in law enforcement. And the Black Lives Matter movement is now largely ignored, despite shaping policy discussions since 2013. Liberalism gave the illusion of progress, but only in small symbolic doses. Once the political climate shifted, so did the commitment to racial justice. Some closing thoughts and key takeaways from this week's presentation are that racial progress is conditional. It happens when it benefits those in power, hence interest-convergence. Liberalism maintains inequality through colorblindness, neutrality, and slow reform. Today's rollbacks aren't new. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, affirmative action bans, and policing shifts follow historic patterns. And next week, we'll be wrapping up our series by discussing counter-storytelling and intersectionality, unpacking how marginalized voices challenge dominant narratives and the layered complexities of minoritized identities. So before we wrap up this week, I want to acknowledge something, that revisiting these histories and seeing the patterns of repeat takes its toll. These aren't just concepts, and they aren't things that are so far in our zeitgeist because our ancestors endured them and our elders experienced them. They affect real lives and real communities that we exist within. So let's take a moment together, just a few deep breaths before we move forward for pause and reflection. Inhale, exhale, release. Inhale, exhale, release. As promised, here are some resources and citations for later. Please pause and screenshot, and also check the description below if watching on YouTube. Thank you for watching and coming on this journey with me. If you found this valuable, please share. Also, make sure you like and subscribe so that way you come back next week and get some information as well. Until then, until next time.